Hello, everyone. President Sunday here. I'm joined once again by Professor Matt McManus, and we're going to be talking about a phrase from a section of your book, The Schmittian Enemies of Postmodern Conservatism. So, just for some clarification to begin with, so by the Schmittian enemies of postmodern conservatism, what is not meant here is advocates of Carl Schmitt's philosophy, who are also enemies of postmodern conservatism. You're invoking sort of a Schmittian, let's say, Schmittian language to describe how the postmodern conservative sort of, in very broad terms, sort of views the social situation in which they find themselves and to which they are reacting.
Yeah, absolutely right. So for those of your listeners who don't know, Carl Schmitt was a early 20th century German jurist, a very, very smart guy, I should say as well, but unfortunately became known as the crown jurist of fascism for his support of Hitler's Nazi regime through the 1930s, which had a calamitous impact on his reputation. He obviously never really recovered his standing after the war, although he continues to have an influence on a surprisingly wide variety of different political ideologies now into the 21st century, including some that you wouldn't expect, right? And Schmitt's major ideas in the concept of the political is that politics is characterized by what he calls the friend-enemy distinction. And he understands this in a very existential sense, right? Where your friends are those who hold to the same existential worldview, if you want to call it that, and are committed to imposing all that upon the social order. And your enemies are those that hold to a completely contrasting existential worldview, or political theology, as he sometimes calls it. And they're also intent upon imposing that order across the body politic. And for Schmitt, there can be no reconciliation between different existential worldviews or political theologies. They have to combat amongst themselves in the realm of politics. And if they're unable to combat successfully in the realm of politics, then of course they're going to combat in the more literal sense of the word through war.
And this is one of the more interesting things about Schmitt, because I came to respect his, not the man so much, but his work, which is fantastically, I think he's one of the best political theorists of the past 300 years, certainly. But he, upon the site of the political as being synonymous with the site, it's like an area description of the conflict between friends and enemies. And what's so interesting about this is that, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before in videos and talks, but there's a really good book by Mogens Herman Hansen, I think, about Athenian democracy, and he points out that the word polis, from which we get the word politics, originally referred to the fortress walls, like the Acropolis at the center of Athens preserves this meaning. So quite literally, the division between friend and enemy in the most concrete sense. And one of the, so right, so when we're talking about in the domain of politics, there's a deep relationship between politics and war in Schmittian thinking. And I think this really comes out in the section that you're talking about of the Schmittian enemies of postmodern conservatism, in that you write at the very beginning of the section here, you characterize it as, oh dear, and I've lost the section, but I'll paraphrase it. You characterize the postmodern conservative relationship, let's say, with their state, with the sovereign, with government, with their broader culture, what have you, with a kind of direct vying for power. And this is distinct for them, on your view. Did you want to comment or correct me on that? Because that was...
Sure. Well, I should say I don't think it's distinct to postmodern conservatives to see politics as an existential struggle for power, right?
Right.
That's not even a particularly postmodern interpretation of politics, right? You can find precedents going all the way back through the history of political realism, down to people like Thucydides, or even Chinese political realism, just to give a few examples, right? So one of the things that I want to point out is that for somebody like Schmitt, right, he inverted the Clausewitzian axiom Carl Schmitt was a war theorist, right, who said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And I think Schmitt can be fairly interpreted as saying, no, right, politics is the continuation of war by other means, right? It's an existential struggle for supremacy where only one existential worldview or political theology can ultimately dominate over a given territorial and demographic polity, right? And one of the things that makes him such an interesting contemporary, and I agree with you that he's a brilliant guy, a very disturbing guy in many respects, is that he had an extraordinary critique of liberalism, implicit and explicit within his work, that really resonates for many people today, particularly on the political right. Because one of the things that Schmitt points out is that liberals and social democrats believe that politics doesn't have to be a conflict-ridden struggle. It can be about dialogue, it can be about discourse, it can be about trying to understand the other side. And as a consequence of this, it means that people with very different existential worldviews or political theologies can cohabitate in the same political space and adopt moderate iterations of their positions and cooperate to build a multicultural and tolerant society, right, through the law. And Schmitt doesn't think that's possible. And he actually sees liberals as being hypocritical on this point by saying that, no, liberalism isn't, and social democracy, I should add, is included in that, isn't some kind of neutral vision of how the state should be organized that allows a lot of different competing worldviews to cohabitate with one another. Liberalism is a very specific metaphysical and political theology and existential worldview. And if you have a liberal society, that means that all other viewpoints are precluded from participation. So liberalism is no different in this respect from other political theologies, right? And he hated it because liberals were hypocritical and unwilling to acknowledge this. And his argument for fascism and far-right politics, of course, was to a certain extent, well, at least we're open about what it is that we want. We see politics as a conflict. In contemporary iterations, we can talk about it as a cultural war. Only one side can win, and we want it to be us, right? And when you see things in these terms, of course, you can't compromise a dialogue or engage in deliberative discourse with your opponents. You can either be defeated by them or you can defeat them, right? And of course, the ambition of any right-thinking person who's sincerely committed to their political theology or existential worldview is to be the winner, right? You want to win and establish a certain homogenous political community that supports your existential worldview or political theology and subordinates all of its competitors.
Right, and just to put that in a shorter way, the critique of liberalism is that it doesn't do away with politics as war. It still conducts politics as war, but it masks this with sort of a legal regime that puts up the facade of there being this sort of peaceable society. Meanwhile, all these things are happening. In fact, if we wanted to relate this to current politics, critiques of the protests come immediately to mind. So. Yeah.
I should say I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the reasons why Schmitt has had an appeal across the political spectrum, and Schmitt, I should say, was a very far right kind of political theorist. Right. He initially supported a kind of traditionalist conservative Catholicism, later became a fascist, and then gradually moved on to a kind of strained anti-cosmopolitan, anti-liberal sentiment near the end of his life. Right. But anyway, people on the left are attracted to Schmitt, in no small part for the reasons you're talking about. They say that liberalism is fundamentally a deficient political theology because it is indifferent to real difference. It doesn't want to respect those who really want to challenge the liberal order. And you're going to see that come out when liberalism is in a time of crisis, right? And has to really deal with very different viewpoints within the body politic. And it's at that point that you'll see liberal regimes using the law to decide whose view counts and whose views do not. For instance, by cracking down on people rioting or picketing or people who want to fundamentally change the status quo. And all of that is really relevant for our time period right now.
Well, I think especially in this case, it's people protesting and rioting and whatnot. And I myself am skeptical of actually equating the riots with the protests generally. But it's specifically people protesting the police firing upon innocent civilians. So when you see liberals call for the National Guard to come out, and I mean, it's already happened. That means opening fire on protesting civilians. It's really interesting and really sort of salient with this sort of line of reasoning, in that this peaceable society, this social harmony, what have you, is being directly used as a cover for what is in fact its polar opposite. Yeah, it's just interesting.
Yeah, and I should say that, going back to the original question, I think this is the way that a lot of postmodern conservatives see the world, right? It's one of the reasons why terminology like culture war is so popular in right-wing and far-right circles, right? Because this is an existential conflict over competing political theologies, and there can be only one winner, right? And one of the reasons why you see postmodern conservatives like Viktor Orban disdain liberalism is for exactly the reasons that Schmitt did, right? Liberals claim that they want tolerance and acceptance and the inclusion of a broad array of worldviews, but when the chips are down, they'll support very specific, substantive outcomes while marginalizing others. In this case, postmodern conservatives are concerned that their views are the ones that are going to be marginalized because they're losing the cultural war, at least in their interpretation, right?
And just for the chat, if you guys have any questions, we're not going to run super long today, because I think we both have a lot of work to get done. So if you have any questions, just ask away at any given time. So yeah. So here's a question for you. So you actually mentioned a book in this part of the text that I haven't read, specifically his, where are we? It's something, here we go. Constitutional theory. So in constitutional theory, you write, Schmitt strikingly connects this sovereign to Rousseauian theory, arguing that in ideal circumstances, it is this figure who speaks for the true general will of the people. Now that's interesting, because I see in a lot of the people who we would probably identify as postmodern conservatives a general, a strong antipathy to Rousseau, which as a reader of Rousseau myself, I always find kind of strange. Rousseau was, by modern standards, tremendously conservative. So would you be willing to expand upon that a little bit? Because I'm interested in this.
Yeah, I should say Rousseau is conventionally held to be a figure on the political left, and has been held to be so at the very least since the 18th century. You can think of the criticisms of people like Edmund Burke or Joseph de Maistre as exemplars there, right? But he really resonates with a lot of conservatives today, in part because conservatism has moved in a more populist direction, much like the political right did in the early 20th century, right? Under the auspices of fascism, right? And in those kinds of circumstances, Rousseau's discussion of why it is that the genuine people should rule and they should push back against cultural elites, and speaking with the authentic voice of the general will, all that really resonates with many conservatives, even if they're not willing to acknowledge the genealogical heritage of these ideas, right? And Schmitt was courageous, I'll give him that, in the sense that he was very willing to dialogue with Rousseau and this kind of unholy marriage of heaven and hell. And one of the things that he says in constitutional theory is, look, Rousseau was exactly right. A democracy cannot be a liberal democracy that tolerates difference, because if you have a society where majority rules, right, that means that the people as a whole aren't speaking. Right? What it means is that some of the people are speaking, 50% plus one, while the remaining 49% don't have a voice, right? Or who are silenced by these kind of political mechanisms. So the only way you can have an authentic democracy is through something like the general will. And the best way to achieve that, according to Schmitt, is to have a leader figure, right? The Führer or the Duce, who speaks and establishes the total polis through their actions and through their political convictions, right? And if this person can authentically claim to speak for the entire body politic, then Schmitt's kind of mysterious view of the word, this is a more authentic democracy than a liberal democracy, because the Führer is really speaking for the entire people rather than just for a 50% plus one, right?
And Yeah, and that's actually one of the curious things that people don't tend to get about Rousseau is that the general will doesn't refer to sort of the result of a plebiscite. In a way, it simply refers to the fact that what the community does is arising from the mass of the people itself. It's not from arising from a particular class within it. It is from the constitution. Like however differentiated the society is, it is arising from the constitution of the society itself, sort of from the demo in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the general will is just one of the more obscure and mysterious concepts in, I'd say, the whole history of political theory. And people have spent decades just trying to figure out what it means. But exactly like you said, it's pretty clearly not just a majoritarian plebiscite, right, where 50% of plus one say this is what we want, and then the will of the people is spoken when you enact that kind of policy. Right? Rousseau makes that very clear. It's not people's actual interests. Or sorry, it's not people's stated interests. It's their actual interests, right? As kind of total whole. And there are circumstances, and he makes this very clear, where people's stated interests might conflict with their actual interests as articulated by the general will. And in this very chilling formulation, he says, in those kinds of instances, people must be forced to be free. Right. Their actual interests, or sorry, their stated interests must be subordinated to their actual interests as articulated by the general will. And it's not hard to see how totalitarians or fascist philosophers like Schmitt might find that extremely appealing, right? And I think we have to be careful here because Rousseau is a lot more complicated than that. In different places he says very different things because he was not at all a kind of consistent person. He was a very moody thinker who changed his mind quite a bit. But in that book, right, I think that people like Isaiah Berlin are correct to say that Rousseau, if not the intellectual godfather of totalitarianism, at least provided totalitarians with a number of weapons that they could use.
Yeah, of course.
Some of which were quite subtle and quite nuanced, both in conceptually and in terms of their application.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but that could be said of any major political thinker, right? I mean, this is the end of a long trajectory of innovations in thought that led to Rousseau in the first place. You have people like Karl Popper who bring it all the way back to Plato. So I mean, it's yeah. So I mean, that's not necessarily a critique necessarily of Rousseau, but definitely he's an ingredient. So if anybody has any questions, again, we're not going very long, so feel free to ask, and we'll try to address them. But otherwise, yeah. So got a few questions here. Not really relating to the topic at hand, unfortunately. You mentioned that Schmitt has a lot of appeal for left-wing writers. I'm actually not familiar.
Well, probably the most famous example of a kind of left-wing appropriation or reading of Schmitt is Giorgio Agamben, right? Starting in his 1997 book, Homo Sacer, and particularly in his 2002 book, State of Exception, right? And Agamben's argument, kind of in line with what I'm talking about, is that liberalism does not really respect difference, right? Liberalism is a metaphysically distinct worldview, political theology, right? And in exceptional moments, when it's confronted by real enemies within the community, it will suspend liberal rights in order to get rid of them, right? To preserve itself, right? And Agamben's kind of backdrop for this was the war on terror, right? The global war on terror. You had the United States, which is the world's greatest liberal power, purporting to believe in freedom of expression, freedom of religion, extreme toleration. But when confronted by an enemy like radical Islam that seemed to pose an existential threat, all of a sudden, a lot of that went out the window, and you saw the emergence of racism towards Muslims and xenophobia and demands that the state assume tremendous power in order to protect the population. And Agamben's point following Schmitt is, this isn't a bug in the system. This is just what liberal societies do when the chips are down. And they're no different in that respect than any other societies. The difference between somebody like Agamben and Schmitt is Schmitt would say, therefore, since liberalism is no different than any other political theology, we should just come right up front about it and have something like a fascist society, right, where there's one political theology overtly enforced overall, establishing a kind of homogenous body politic, right? Whereas Agamben would say, this goes to show you why liberalism is still inadequate, and what we need is a new political theology that actually respects difference, is genuinely democratic and inclusive, and so on and so forth, whatever form that could possibly take, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we've described the Schmittian enemies of sort of postmodern conservatives from the view of postmodern conservative. That is to say, the enemies of their brand of conservatism, or their these brands of conservatism, sort of from within their vantage. What are the things against which they have to struggle to succeed? I would like to look at that from the other angle, because I'm a little bit unaware of actual Schmittian critics of these sort of tendencies, and I'm curious if you have any insight into that. Because one of the things I do notice is that generally conservatives of all stripes do seem, with exceptions, of course, of certain big R Republicans and big C conservatives, do tend to view politics in that way. But I see very little actual engagement with Schmitt generally. In fact, strangely enough, the only people on the right who I've seen in popular politics, at least certainly on this platform, have been people in sort of the Richard Spencer, Keith Woods crowd. So it's obviously not even postmodern conservative, really. We're talking about radical revolutionary white nationalists. So yeah, I'm a little bit interested. Are there Schmittian writers who address this, or does Schmitt address this directly? Because clearly this is old. He was contending with, I mean, his own stance on Hitler, for example, is one of absolute contempt. So I'm a little bit curious. Do you know of any Schmittians who are enemies of postmodern conservatism, as you construe it?
You mean, are there any Schmittian postmodern conservatives, or are people on the political right who invoke Schmitt in a positive way?
That would be interesting too. But I'm thinking in particular critics of sort of these streams of conservatism that you would characterize as postmodern conservative, who are themselves arguing from a Schmittian lens.
Yes, I mean, there are certain Catholic radicals in particular, or Christian radicals in the United States, right, who call for a closer association between church and state than has been allowed under the American Constitution since its founding. And they tend to invoke Schmittian type arguments against Trumpism, right? With the argument that its populist connotations don't go far enough in displaying the conviction that we need to see if we're actually going to get the right political theology in place, right? Mm-hmm. Where I would differ from you is I would say that many of these people are actually postmodern conservatives, and that's because postmodern conservatism isn't one thing or another, right? They don't hold necessarily to one specific ideological viewpoint. What characterizes somebody as a postmodern conservative is their embeddedness in postmodern culture and the disposition they take in reaction to that, much more than their stated political convictions.
Right. Okay. So it's a formal distinction. It's not in terms of content per se. Mm-hmm. Okay. And
the other thing I should say also is that you don't typically find many people on the political right, except for the political far right, who will directly invoke Schmitt, right? Much like you didn't see many people invoke Machiavelli up until the 19th century, right? And I think the reasons are fairly obvious, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, Carl Schmitt was the crown jurist of the Nazi Third Reich, and everything that you would expect somebody like that to do, he did, right? He wrote nasty things about Jews. He talked about granting Hitler extraordinary amounts of power, although, as you said, he himself seemed to have had mixed feelings, to put it lightly, about Hitler as a person, right? And, he had all kinds of xenophobic and nationalistic kind of assertions running throughout all his work in the 1930s. And so that's a pretty toxic thing to associate yourself directly with if you're on the political right. I think it's a little easier if you're on the political left, because what you can kind of do is say, well, I'm extracting the critique of liberalism that's useful here, but I'm using it for very different purposes than Schmitt himself intended the critique of liberalism to be used for, because I want a more democratic, inclusive society that really respects difference, and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. If you're on the political right and you invoke Schmitt, most people, and I think there's some justice to this, will immediately think that you're a fascist or at least a proto-fascist, right?
Maybe that's optimistic. I actually haven't met with many people who are even remotely conversant with Schmitt in the first place. It's been, which I suppose makes sense. It's only been really published in English in the past 20 years. Like, I think the concept of the political that you can get, I don't think it's Telos who publishes it. It's somebody else, but it's not old. It's like 20 or 30 years, but it hasn't been.
Yeah, it's the University of Chicago Press is right. What published most of his work. And his work wasn't really very well known outside of mostly German emigres, right? Like people like Hannah Arendt wrote extensively about his work. Jürgen Habermas, wrote about him, and his work was widely published in the English-speaking world. But it was only starting in the 1990s, I agree with you, that you really saw Schmitt as a distinct political figure on his own, or political analyst on his own, kind of resurge in the academic consciousness. And there are a lot of reasons for this, most of which I think are actually quite interesting. But he was essentially a persona non grata that you didn't want to have anything to do with up until that point.
Okay. So, yeah, it was just a short section we were talking about, so we can go however you want to from here. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free.
Mean, if your audience has like 1 or 2 questions, I'd be happy to answer that. And then I have to go back to editing, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is just going to be a short little thing. So if anybody has any questions about anything we were talking about, feel free. Otherwise, we'll just call it. And yeah, just a short little chat. So let us know. Just going up here a little bit. Okay, so somebody mentioned Moldbug being the quintessential example of postmodern conservatism. I'm curious, since your discussion with the distributors, have you looked into Moldbug at all, or?
No, I haven't, unfortunately. Right now, actually, what I'm engaging with is a fairly extensive reading of the history of materialism. And then I'm looking at more conventional, kind of moderate conservative text in preparation for a class I have to give starting at college, starting in August, on the history of conservative thought. So that includes, some people that I really don't like, but I also have to be fair. I make sure that there's some stuff that's a little bit more moderate on the agenda, right?
What's a moderate conservative on your reading? Just out of curiosity.
Well, a moderate conservative is somebody, I would say, at least in a Western context, who supports something like ordered liberty, right? There's this belief that, you can find this in people like William Blackstone or Edmund Burke or Stephen Harper, right? For example, I think he is well characterized as an ordered liberty conservative. And usually the belief is that they hold with liberals that people are moral equals. They also believe that the state should largely get out of the way of people fulfilling their dreams. But they also think that if you're going to have society that respects liberty, it's not enough just to have an institutional legal framework. You need things like little brigades and traditions, a culture that respects freedom, and all of that can't necessarily be built. It has to be spontaneously generated from the ground up, and we should resist efforts to undermine this kind of spontaneous generation. And the left is frequently guilty, essentially, of trying to cut off the roots from which liberty flows by corroding institutions like the family or the church or whatever it happens to be, without recognizing the kind of vital role they play.
Noah Watson asks, do you think that a society can overcome the friend-enemy distinction? And if so, how does it do this?
I think that it can, right? And there are a lot of writers who talked about this. Again, I think probably the most profound is Erich Fromm, right? Particularly in his book, The Art of Loving, right? So Erich Fromm was a Frankfurt School critical theorist who was very well aware, I should say, of Schmitt's work, right? And one of the things that he says is that we have to understand political love as a distinctive form of respect for people's freedom and for people's individuality, right? And Fromm says that most of us, including people like Schmitt, don't really want people to be free because we are concerned about the chaotic consequences of allowing too much freedom in the world. Because freedom, of course, means the freedom to hurt me or to undermine me in some way, shape, or form, right? Whereas real love means respecting people in their freedom, allowing them to be what they are, and to actually draw inspiration from their individuality and from their acts of freedom, right? And it's important to note that Fromm said, yes, you can create political institutions and political cultures that will generate forms of political love and political friendship, right? But it's ultimately also an individual thing, right? People have to develop the maturity that's needed in order to respect genuine difference. And that's a hard thing to do, and it's something that we still haven't accomplished in the 21st century. And there's no magic formula for that. I think there's a number of tactics that we can talk about, but I ultimately think it's the only solution to the political travails that we're in right now.
Well, one of the curious tactics that we might talk about that's sort of apropos this topic are sort of calls by certain radical, not really, I don't really know if you want to call them conservative at that point, but radical groups to balkanize Western democracies along racial, religious, what have you grounds. And curiously, you can encompass that in the same language. I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether or not that is in fact the motivation. I mean, certainly social harmony is invoked, and maybe that's something that's part of the ideal that is presumed to result from this. But yeah,
well, here I'll give you an example, right? Like, there's always this kind of belief underpinning many traditionalist forms of conservatism, a more reactionary variance of conservatism, that you can only love somebody who's like yourself, right? That love is based on commonality, right? Especially political love, right? Makes sense?
right. Yeah.
And one of the things that Fromm points out, and he's not the only one, again, you could stress people like Slavoj Žižek as another good example, or Hannah Arendt herself, is that if you can only love somebody because they are like you, that is not real love. That's narcissism. In a very literal sense of the word, right? You need to stare at yourself in the mirror and admire yourself in order for there to be any kind of stability. Real love comes when somebody is very different than you, and not only do you accept that, but you cherish it, right? You cherish the person in their individuality and in their specificity in the ways that they differ from you. Okay? And conservatism in that sense isn't really about, like reactionary conservatism isn't about really loving anyone. Right? It's about loving yourself and the people that are like you. And I think it's responsible for a lot of the problems that we have in our society right now. Precisely this kind of narcissistic outlook that the only thing that matters in life is me and people who are like me.
Yeah.
Right? And if we really want to overcome the narcissism and nihilism of modernity, what we need is a much more inclusive, much more open-minded society that looks at the people around us who hold a variety of different viewpoints, so long as they're reasonable and respectable, and says this is something to cherish and something to learn from, not something to be hostile to or afraid of. Right?
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. It's sort of a tangent, but I've been thinking a little bit recently about sort of a meme in a lot of these groups, which is a need to return to quote unquote traditional gender roles. And typically what this implies is a servile role for the woman in a heterosexual relationship. And I keep thinking when I see this, it's like it's first of all, it's a little bit insulting to yourself to only want someone who reflects at the lower level what you perceive to be your own best qualities. I don't know. It's almost not narcissistic in a way. It's almost. I mean, I can see how you would characterize it that way, since it is referring to the self in the description of the love object. But there's also. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to put words to this, but it's the general conservative, and I don't even know if this is strictly postmodern conservative, but from what I've seen, the general conservative attitude towards love I find somewhat disturbing. As a former conservative myself, I find like that kind of strange. So maybe this is will this help me get back on track? I'm a bit scatterbrained this morning. I just woke up. Jack Galbraith asks, Matt, what's your thoughts on Roger Scruton's conservatism?
I actually have a lot of respect for that. Interestingly enough, I just finished reading a book by him called The Soul of the World last week, which I would strongly recommend. It's from Yale University Press. It's pretty cheap, I think about $20 on Amazon.ca. And it concerns his argument for what's a transcendent value in life,
right,
for beings such as ourselves. I think Roger Scruton falls very nicely into the kind of ordered liberty paradigm that I was talking about before. And there's a lot to be said for that. Right, even people on the left can learn lessons from it. Particularly, his kind of stress on the fact that for a lot of us, right, virtue begins by dealing with small things, right? Yeah. Being nice to the person next to you, being nice to your wife, being a better friend, to your buddy, who you've known for a long time. And I think that he's right that sometimes left-wing people don't pay enough attention to these small-scale virtues because they're too obsessively interested in macrological or structural injustices, right?
Yeah.
Which means you can have people be assholes in person while expressing a great deal of concern for, the plight of the working class or the plight of marginalized communities, all of which is fine in my opinion. But you have to recognize, that doesn't let you off the hook for being a good person yourself, right? To those around you. I also think that Scruton is right that little institutions, the kind of everyday things that we interact with, are what matter to a lot of people in their life. Right? Your baker, the bar that you go to, that restaurant that you and your wife or you and your girlfriend enjoy, all of these things make a big difference for people. And again, that can sometimes be papered over by the statism that you'd see traditional socialism be myopically attentive to.
Right.
The idea that all good things in life have to come from the state, or they should be provided from the state. Private interactions are always going to be exploitative, so we should get rid of them to the extent possible. I have a lot of good things to say about Roger Scruton in that respect. Where I think he really goes seriously far afield is turning a blind eye to all the many injustices that still run rampant throughout our society, right?
Yeah.
And you can see that in who he chooses to engage with, right? So, for instance, John Rawls, somebody I typically bring up, points out that if you believe that our societies should be places where people care for one another and that are fair, then you have to look at the world that we live in right now and say, first off, we don't care very much for one another. And secondly, it is certainly not fair. We certainly don't live in a fair society. So what we need are some pretty big changes in order to get things on the right track. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Scruton never actually took this argument on in a direct way, because he just seemed to have had this visceral reaction to any effort to try to redistribute goods or any effort to change things too dramatically, even if it was done in a good way, right? And in a way that would preserve a lot of the things that he valued and cherished. And that's where, you start to see his own kind of bad tendencies creep out.
Well, I like that you bring that up, because it's occurred to me that a major part of sort of the invidiousness of the left-right divide is largely because of people, first of all, who have been severely burned by the social context in which they were raised, wanting to see those things repaired now, and people who feel a great nostalgic, and not just merely nostalgic, but a great love for the things that they come from. And these people are contesting in a quite existential way over their own environment. And you find that's often how these things are juxtaposed. Conservatives are generally concerned with the destruction of art, with the I don't know what's the word, the uglification, if you will, of the spaces in which they live. A lot of people on the radical left, by contrast, you see the defacement of statues, what have you, they're concerned with repairing injustices being done towards people specifically, and they've, in a serious sense, been alienated from the spaces from which they come from. This is just a super general term, but I'm actually grateful that you brought up that you were able to respond to the Roger Scruton point, because I think one of the things you get unfairly characterized as being is sort of condemnatory of postmodern conservatives as a blanket thing, and on my reading, that's not true. I think from what I've read, what you're doing is you're pointing out to people who, in many respects, have very serious concerns that merit addressing, that there is an element in the way in which they're framing their political activity that they themselves, on their own frames of reference, should find disturbing.
Yeah, I always take the Adornian, Theodore Adorno, kind of position that you should never just sit there and say something is untrue or something is bad, right? Sometimes things are untrue and sometimes they're bad, but they often express a truth or express a need that has some validity to it, right? So while I think that postmodern conservatism, as I pointed out in all my books, is a bad reaction to the enemy, if you want to call it, of postmodernity, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some reaction to it, right? Because there's a lot of problems with postmodernity. And what I've always been trying to encourage people who might be tempted by the reactionary outlook to do is say, look, what is it that you really, really want, right? Do you want to go back to the 19th century when people would die at the age of 28 because most of them would be thrown into a factory where they'd be exploited and they'd see most of their children die and then they kind of wither away to nothing? Do you want to go back to the 1950s, when the state could conscript you and draft you to go fight against your communist enemies in some country you'd never heard of, and where most women could be beaten by their husbands, would be cheated on by their husbands, abandoned by their husbands, and nobody gave a damn? Do you want to return to the medieval era? Well, everyone believed uniformly in the same kind of religious precepts, but the Catholic Church, tremendous amounts of money from them, held vast tracts of land, despised, the ordinary individuals who actually did most of the working and toiling. I don't think so, right? So rather than look to the past for resources, what we should be looking to is our own creative imaginations and our sense of what it is that we should be trying to achieve collectively in order to better than the people who have come before us, right?
Right, and I mean, you can you can walk that down quite a bit too. Like, you don't necessarily have to say, like, for example, women were beaten, what have you, which is true in a lot of cases. You could simply say that there was a culture that discouraged women from actualizing their potential as full human beings. That's bad enough, I think.
And just to kind of answer your question, because I thought you made a very interesting point about men and women earlier on that we never really got into, right? Simone de Beauvoir actually articulated this point with a tremendous gravity in her book, The Second Sex, right? Where she said, what is it that most men want, right? Most men, heterosexual men, right? Yeah. They want someone to love and to recognize them as a person of value, right? But who's going to do that, right? If the person that you marry is somebody who you consider beneath you, right, or servile, they can never provide you with the kind of love and recognition that you need because you don't think that their opinion is worth a damn, right? The only way that most men, heterosexual men, can get the kind of love and recognition that they want is to be with somebody who they treat as an equal, whose opinion that they respect, who has dreams and loves and hopes and aspirations of her own. And because it's only in those circumstances that they can mean a lot to her, right? Yeah. They can be more to her than just a master. And this is what was fundamentally unstable and ungratifying about traditional gender roles. And I don't think that conservatives have ever really given a very good response to this criticism, just because they're still nostalgically attached to the idea that once upon a time, people more or less did what they were supposed to, and there wasn't really a lot of complaining about it, so people must have been content. And I think if you look at the 19th century, with all the kind of animosities that are bubbling through in the literature, people weren't very content with this. Right?
Now, this is where
they kind of dealt with it in a tough-minded way, which isn't the same thing as finding it very gratifying.
Now, this is where it gets kind of sneaky, though, and I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you have to get back to work. But just as an additional comment to that, the response is typically, well, no, that characterization is ahistorical. We don't want to go back to that, surely. And it's like, okay, fine. You've given an alternate historical account that excludes these things. Fair enough. The problem is that now you're dealing with these people, and what they now want to remove, or what they blame for the current social ills that they want to undo, are precisely those things that were responsible for removing those elements from the actual historical case in the first place. So nobody, of course, actually advocates for a situation in which women are abused, what have you, working class people aren't treated well. But precisely because it's reaction, the orientation is not actually to look at the past and see what actually produced these goods, and therefore how can we maintain them while removing the bad. The orientation is towards, these things are agitating us, remove those, period. And there's sort of a naive assumption that a lot of the things that, I mean, even structurally characterize the way in which they conceive of a good society to be today, are themselves historically dependent for their initial formulation on these changes. So, like, one of the things that struck me again is like, it's curious. So among these groups, you'll see strong tendencies towards elitism and monarchism and things of that sort, where they want the competent people to be in charge and making the decisions. In fact, it's what a lot of the draws of Catholicism for a lot of these people is that whatever its philosophical problems, it forces people to adhere to some kind of order, and that's good. And yet at the same time, the overwhelming antagonist in their political world is elites doing precisely that. So it's curiously both liberal and democratic in the process of being anti-liberal and anti-democratic. So
no, absolutely. And you find that this is one of the things that characterizes a lot of reactionary discourse, right? Reactionary discourse is parasitic on what it's contemptuous of, right? A huge amount of its kind of affective energy comes from hating something, right? Or despising something. And you're never going to find a very original political thought that comes from that kind of attitude, right? And the same is true, I'd say, of somebody like Carl Schmitt, right? Carl Schmitt was a very original thinker when he was reacting against liberalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when it came time to look at his own substantive contributions, there's nothing, right? There's fascism, right? And we all know how that turned out. And the same is true of reactionaries throughout history, right? Think back to somebody like Joseph de Maistre, who we've talked about at some length before, right? Yeah. Joseph de Maistre can be very eloquent in his enunciation of the French revolutions, and he could actually be quite probing in his criticisms of people like Rousseau. What did he have to respond to this with? Well, kill 4 million French people, put the Bourbons back on the throne, and everything will be hunky-dory, right?
Yeah.
Well, they did just that, and it lasted 20 years, and the whole thing fell apart again, right? So what I think we need to see here is a more dialectical approach to the understanding of political phenomenon, which is always absent in the work of people like Carl Schmitt. And I guess I'll just end with this, right? The fundamental problem with the reactionary worldview is that these people always have a nostalgic image of how the past operated, and they presume that their nostalgized ideal was somehow orderly and good, and it fell apart because of vulgarity or decadence, or people were just not capable of holding to it anymore. And my response to that is always no. These things fell apart because they didn't work very well to begin with. Right? People broke from Catholicism because Catholicism, as it existed in the 18th century, was a pretty crappy system. Right? People broke from patriarchal gender roles because they were pretty crappy, both for men and for women. Right? Yeah. Now that doesn't mean we should just replace it with anything. Right? We need to be careful about what we replace it for. But you shouldn't just assume that the reason these things fell apart was because people were bad and they didn't want to hold to them anymore. They fell apart because they didn't work well.
No, they agitated people. They weren't happy, and I've said this in argument with a lot of these people. It's like, look, we left that for a reason. It's not just because the dirty, rotten elites wanted a new atheistic, humanistic, global world order. Those things emerged largely from the bottom up. But anyways, I'm going to let you get back to your work. If anybody has any questions for me, I'll stay on for a few more minutes just in case anybody wants to chat.
Tell people they're free to email me whenever they'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. So your email can be found. Can I put in the description, or I don't know if you.
No problem.
Okay, sure. So I'll put his email into the description. So anybody who watches after this is up, you can email him with questions or what have you. Please be polite to our guests. That being said, thank you again, Professor McManus, for joining me.
Sure.
It was very interesting. You have a good evening.
Yourself as well. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye. All right, so I'll just hang around and I'll answer some questions if anybody has any more for me. Otherwise, we'll just call it. This is just going to be something really short. I actually do have a video that I'm hoping to publish tonight in response to the Distributists video on the last Distributist response I will ever be making, I think. What is it called again? It was a new dialogue on race or something like that, a new discourse on race. I forget, but it was against the anti-whites was the subtitle. So hopefully that will be done within the next couple of hours. I was mostly working on it last night, but I completely lost my voice and just gave up. So it's a slog. It is such a slog. But yeah, if anybody has any questions for me or you guys want to talk about anything, let me know because I've got a bit of time to kill here. So. That's correct, Ilvani. I do indeed have yet to read the second sex. I'm waiting. How's everybody doing? Northern Observer says, well, yes and no, the Russian Revolution was, I don't know if this was fine too. I guess there's a conversation going on already. Right. Anyways, he says something kind of interesting. The Russian Revolution was a pure mistake only made possible by the war. Russia would have gotten there eventually, but the radicals jumped in. I don't know about that. I don't know that the Russian Revolution was a pure mistake. I mean, when you look at what was actually going on in the war, and just what was happening to the peasantry in Russia. It's been a little while since I've read the history of the Russian Revolution, but it was rough. There were reasons why there was appeal in the revolutionary parties, right? Like these were fundamentally democratic movements, not in the sense that they respected the decision of the population, but in the sense that the seat of power was in the masses of the people. So yeah. Here, I'm just gonna open up chess here, just so we have something on the screen. Da, 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 da. Yeah, there we go. All right. Oh, we're not even playing yet. There we go. Haha. All right. If anybody wants to play, you can see my name. Mr. Blank says Moldbug doesn't take himself as seriously as you guys seem to think he does. I mean, I don't pay much attention to Moldbug. I find him kind of tedious. He's just not conversant with. I mean, look, I know it sounds douchey and everything, but the problem with Moldbug is that he takes a very sort of layperson's understanding of political concepts and he fills in the blanks with just stuff that he's picked off from, like, almost at random, right? Like, why does he read De Maistre? Why does he read Rothbard? Da, 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 da. I mean, he clearly didn't find these guys as a result of studying the history of political thought. He found these guys because he picked them out because they were reactionaries and monarchists and people that could be deployed against his own political enemies. So, yeah, it's. I mean, sure, I'm sure Curtis Yarvin isn't as bad as he's made out to be in a lot of cases. I just don't find him that interesting. And the problem is that his bad material is still being used, right? Like, these guys are still talking about the cathedral like it's a coherent entity. It's really not. At least it's not a useful one, I think. I could be wrong. Like, I'm not a genius, so who knows? And the last man says, I think you'll say distributist is attacking easy targets instead of addressing people like James Baldwin. No. That's not actually going to be the essence of what I'm saying at all. In fact, I actually haven't read James Baldwin, I'm going to be honest. The basic point is going to be that see, my issue with that one, it's not actually any of his individual theses, it's that he's being really sneaky in that video. I'll get into why when I actually publish it, because I don't want to misrepresent myself in advance, but Lily Voitooth asks, why do you think these neo-reactionary types become Catholic except for just being Protestants? Why do you think these neo-reactionary types become Catholic except for just being... I'm not sure what you mean by that. Can you clarify your question, Lily? All right. What am I doing here? There we go. Northern Observer observes, my understanding is that Rothbard is a nut. I don't think Rothbard's a nut. But then I have to admit I haven't read much Rothbard at all. A little bit from the Libertarian Reader, if I'm remembering the name correctly. It might have been somebody else. But, I mean, look, like, human beings are very clever, right? We can take a sentence and we can construct a system out of it. A massive system. It's like economics. It's like the work of a lot of 20th century economists. These super clever, super complex systems for predicting the future, basically. Ingeniously constructed, absolutely boring. They don't tell you anything about reality. So it's at least not in the sense that they would like them to. Yeah, Lily, if you could retype that question, I'm really not sure I understand what you're saying. Why do you think these neo-reactionary types become Catholic except for just being Protestants? Do you mean Protestant in terms of like the actual content of their beliefs? Like they're basically Protestants? I mean, it's true in a way. Like a lot of these Catholic reactionary types are in actuality what would be called schismatics, right? So like they are against, yeah, because Protestant denominations tend to split. I mean, yeah, maybe. Oh, I made a mistake. I am terrible at chess when I am playing it with an audience, I've learned. really makes me respect those people who play multiple games of chess at once. So. Okay, so here we go. Willie actually clarified. So usually they are from majority Protestant countries like America. If they become Christian for conservative reasons, why become Catholic when they are in the minority? I think they become Catholic because the Catholic Church, unlike Protestant churches, and this is crucial, sort of maintains some unity in its structure. It sort of represents, I mean, again, like a common characterization by neo-reactionaries of sort of the mainstream of politics is of the cathedral, right? The cathedral, like the church, if you will, is a symbol not just of religious unity, but of political power. And there is still institutional power. Like I think the academic agent at one point was trying to fake a conversion to Catholicism so he could get his kid into a Catholic school. This is what I read. Just weird, but yeah. Akira Kazuya says to appeal to a perfect, unadulterated hierarchy. I think that's actually a good point. And I'm saying this from experience, like for myself, the appeal of the Catholic Church when I was in high school, it wasn't theological in nature. In fact, I had a lot of issues with its theology. It was because I was agitated by just a lot of the crazy stuff that was going on with the basically unregulated theology of different Protestant sects, and Catholicism offered an antidote to that, or so it seemed. Dilvani the Goddess says, "Why do you always shit on economics?" I don't always shit on economics. I'm just not an economist, so. But I mean, I really don't. Like, here's the thing: economics is extremely interesting and important. It's not a substitute for political theory, and it's only a problem when it's being deployed as a substitute for political theory. Why is that a problem? Well, because there's categories of problems in politics that if you reduce them to economic questions are completely paved over. And yeah, it's not good. We want to know what we're talking about, right? So, yeah. Political theory isn't a hard science. However, it is a science understood in the classical sense. There we go. What else have we got here? Katsuma Kyoto. So how did you like Distributist video on race? Will you do a separate vid on it or talk it here? I'm not going to talk about it here just because I'm going to lose my voice. I've already lost it recording that one. The quality is not going to be great because of allergies and whatnot. My voice has been crazy scratchy for the last little while. But it's going to be long. It's going to be very long. I think it's going to pop out at about 50 minutes, whereas his video is like 25. And oh my God, I can't listen to this guy's voice any longer. It's driving me insane. It's just bad. I mean, one of the things that I'm going to bring up is that, I mean, look, like I'm not obsessively hating on people who think in racial terms, right? I disagree with them, but like I can have a positive conversation with someone like Keith Woods, who is much more racially radical than the Distributist is. So why am I bothering with the Distributist? Well, because in this video in particular, this is one of the most obvious cases. He is deploying exactly the same kind of racial argument as a Keith Woods or even a Richard Spencer or a Jared Taylor. In fact, he's an ardent defender of Jared Taylor. But like, he's being extremely dishonest about it. He's trying to frame racial arguments as cultural arguments, and it's deceptive. And what my main objection here isn't so much the racial position, even though I do have substantial objections against that, which I think stick. My issue there is that he's lying. That's always been like the major thing for me. I can stomach people with radically different or noxious views to mine, but lying is not okay. Period. So we'll get into that when that goes up. Thoughts on Nick Land, if any? I don't have any thoughts on Nick Land. I've never read Nick Land. Like there's too much to read, right? Like I have to make this. Like look, any like Nomos of the Earth by Carl Schmitt. Dense reading. It'll take you months. Thucydides is faster, despite it only being like 340 or so pages long. I have to decide between reading that and reading something else. And at some point, like, I have to make a decision. And when I make my decision with fringe people like Nick Land or Moldbug or what have you, who write a lot, and this is the problem with political cranks generally, is they write a lot. And maybe that's presumptuous because I haven't read Nick Land, but I've heard things. I've heard things that make me wonder. But they write a lot. They write a lot because they aren't self-critical enough, so they're not modest with what they can say. So I mean, like, if you just like reading Nick Land or reading Moldbug, that will take you months of time. In that time, there's people like Agamben that I haven't read. I haven't read all of Carl Schmitt. I haven't read all of Arendt even. I've got a bunch of books of philosophy here. I've got The Essential Person on my desk, which I've only read a couple of essays in. Sea Power States by Andrew Lambert, which I've been excited to read. I still haven't had time to. So yeah, I just can't. And when I see the kinds of people who advocate Nick Land and Moldbug and whatnot, I'm just not impressed enough to sacrifice the time, right? Like they're not influential enough for it to be sort of a professional duty to. Like if you have to read Marx, even if you strongly disagree with Marx, again, Marx is another one. I haven't read Marx in as much depth as I need to. So it's too much to read, too much. Paul Gottfried wrote a book on Carl Schmitt. Is it any good? I have no idea. This is the situation. So reading First Political Theory by Dugin is all you need to know about Keith and Spencer. I've heard them talk about Dugin a lot. I've also heard them be very critical of Dugin. There's a brief period of time in which I was talking to that group. They invited me after I made some critiques of the academic agent to a Twitter conversation. We ended up arguing a lot, as you might imagine, but there were some interesting conversations. My impression is that they aren't really Duginists, although there's almost sort of they're conciliatory to Dugin in a way. He's kind of like sort of like how G.K. Chesterton has some sort of dumb moments in his writing that don't really track reality. People are sort of forgiving of that because he's G.K. Chesterton. I think Dugin sort of holds a warm place in their hearts as kind of a fellow traveler. But yeah, I don't know anything about Dugin. There's so much I don't know that I haven't read on. One of the things I will say this, Katsuma Kyoto says Keith Woods reads and is very open with his belief. I'm totally opposing him, but at least I respect that. That's basically my opinion on Keith Woods. I think for whatever are serious disagreements, and they are serious disagreements, like radical, we are never going to be on the same side politically. But I think he's generally real. I don't think he's dishonest about where he's coming from. I think he is trying to reason through things, and at the very least, I can respect that. So I don't go after Keith Woods because first of all, he's already a political pariah, so him being cast out into the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth doesn't require my help. And furthermore, I do think he's sincere. That doesn't mean he's decent. That doesn't mean he's good. But I think he's sincere, and I like that. I really like that line that Carl Schmitt quotes. Granted, Nazi jurist, but he quotes of Goethe. He who is forever striving, we can redeem, or it's him who is forever striving, him we can redeem. And the basic idea is that, like, look, if you're actually like struggling and you're working through problems because you want to solve those problems and not because you're deploying them for therapy, like if you're actually striving to understand, you're real. Like you still have your soul, and I think that characterizes Keith Woods. I don't think he's just an ideological scarecrow at this point, like so many other people have become. I'm definitely very critical of him, but I think he's real. So I would tend to be generous, more so with him than with a lot of other people in that sphere, by a fairly wide margin. Nonetheless, again, massive disagreements that we would probably come to blows over if we actually had to enact our respective political ideals. But so far, it's on YouTube, so we can just kind of chat, and that's okay. I don't think he's a phony. I think in a lot of respects, like he's a kid, right? A smart kid. Don't get me wrong. I think he's very wrong, but he's a smart kid. But he's a kid. There's simply no way in hell that he's He's read as much as he would have to. I mean, this goes for me as well. He's read as much as he would have to actually make for it to be really appropriate for him to start staking himself as an intellectual on some political faction, right? So, if it was up to me, like, not if it was up to me, but what I would advise for him, honestly, is just to back away from the YouTube stuff. Just read, come back in a few years when you're sort of more developed and you're not being sort of tugged around by political ideologues. Because I think the tragedy of Keith Woods is that he's surrounded by people who are bluntly much dumber than him, but more established in the political sphere in which he's found himself largely by accident. I think aligning with people like Mike Enoch and Richard Spencer is a massive mistake, and I think it's going to bite him in the ass after a little while. But, what can you do? What else have we got? Lily Voigt to just read the Marx Engels reader. That's been suggested to me. I know Cuck Philosophy had that on his reading list a little while ago. Oh, is it my turn? This guy's going to get mad. I'm taking so long making moves. Oh, actually, he's taking more time than me, so we're okay so far. We're still okay. Okay, what's going to happen here? Am I about to get screwed? Okay. What else have we got? Kira Kuzawa says, not Kira Kuzawa, Katsumi Kyoto. No, it is Akira Kuzawa. Of course, you think he's real because he reflects your bias about the right. I'm a bit curious. What do you think my bias about the right is? I'm assuming you're referring to me. Oh, I see. You're talking to Katsumi. My apologies. Yeah, if you guys have any critiques of like stuff that you've heard me say, like I'm still in my 20s, right? Like I'm not late 20s, granted. Scary. But I'm not a professor or anything. So I'm very interested in being corrected, before I end up making mistakes of a Peterson degree at his age. Locke's logo says, I'm late again, but a man is never late, nor is he early, but he arrives precisely when he means to. That is a wizard. Logos, you are late. And you do not mean to be late. You are late because you are human and you fail as a human. So, sorry. I'm kidding. I like you, Logos. Logos is a nice guy. The Vanity Goddess. I mean, making videos is external incentive to read books. It absolutely is. One of the things I really like about this channel, like we're tiny, right? I think we just hit like 864 subscribers. We probably lost a few from this one, but that's fine. Yeah, one of the things I really like about this is that it's been really putting a fire under my ass to actually do my work and sort of consolidate my understanding on a lot of things. And no doubt after this, I'm going to have to do that more because I noticed here, like, for example, I was terribly prepared for this conversation. It was a tiny, tiny portion of text that we were reading on. And I mean, this takes so much time. Like just planning conversations takes so much time. Not as much time as long form videos, but and then you're a lot more nervous and It's definitely given me a lot of respect for people who do this frequently. I have no idea how the academic agent managed to do these 3 long-hour streams. Hour and a half and I'm totaled. All right, how's the chess game going? Oh, we're still waiting on him. Okay. I actually applied to be a mod on Vouch's Discord, so that's going to be kind of interesting if that happens. Distinctly possible it won't, but that'd be kind of funny. I'm starting to like Vouch quite a bit actually these days. Strangely enough, same reason as I kind of am generous to Keith Woods. Like I think I've got issues with him, very serious issues, a lot of them. But I think he's sincere, and that counts a lot for me. Sometimes that's enough. What have we got? Thoughts on Trudel Tom? I don't know who Trudel Tom is. Can anybody enlighten me? I've heard the name before. I don't know. I don't understand anything about him though. Thank you, Katsumi. So Katsumi says, Sunday, I'm very glad you do these conversations. Really good change and good stuff there. Thank you. Yeah. This one, again, was a little bit sloppy. This was my fault. But yeah, McManus is very interesting. I'm not sure I agree with everything he says, but I do think he's serious. Obviously, the book he wrote has a polemic edge to it, like the postmodern part of postmodern conservatism that is directly aimed to light a fire in conservatives who don't want to be postmodern at all costs. But I think generally he has some good insights. I think it's fairly widely read. I've read critiques of sort of his general approach. I don't really, I'm not equipped to evaluate them right now. I take things kind of tentatively. So when I do interviews, I try not to like I'll push back on things like where I think I have a point to make, and sometimes I think I have a point to make and I don't. But I mean, yeah. So yeah, right. So I try not to like attack these people for their views while they're on stream. I don't actually have a lot that I want to attack McManus on, really, that I can think of. In fact, probably nothing now that I'm thinking about it. But like when I have Clifford Bates on, for example. Now he has some political views that I don't agree with. Nonetheless, I think he has tremendous value as a political theorist. He's a very well-read man, way more so than me. Oh, what am I? Wow, did I just have a stroke? I thought this was on the white square. Okay, what? Okay, shoot. Hang on. Give me a second. What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do about this pickle? Let's do. Hmm. 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 What a pickle. Screw it. We'll go there. I don't know if that's a good idea. I just want to put that down so I can finish what I was saying. Yeah, right. So I don't want to like get into fights with these guys. I want to try and draw out their ideas so we can sort of evaluate them for ourselves and learn from them. Because again, like even with people like Clifford Bates, I'm not a conservative anymore. I used to be. He very much is a conservative, and we disagree on things. But first of all, I'm not competent to critique him on anything directly. He'd wipe the floor with me. Secondly, I don't want to attack the guy. I have a lot of respect for him. Ideological differences aside, again, an extremely well-read thinker. His book, Aristotle's Best Regime, is one of the most incisive books on Aristotelian philosophy I've ever seen. So it'd be doing myself a disservice to like fight this guy on stuff like this. Now, I mean, within reason, right? Like, if he advocated something that was like that I thought was evil, I would go against that strongly. I don't think he would. I think Clifford Bates is generally actually a quite kind person. But yeah, I mean, the appeal of this whole thing to me is that I get to learn from it. So it's a balancing act. What have we got? Okay, so back to Trudel Tom. So Trudel Tom is a deleted YouTuber who was a philosophical, political YouTube personality that no longer produces content. Good content generally. I have no idea. I haven't looked into his stuff. Have I heard of Vauch's quote unquote political line? Maybe. I have to look again. JM says, still looking for an interpretation of Marx that has a different result than our already existing historical examples. What do you mean by that, JM? Already existing historical examples. If you mean the Soviet Union and China, that doesn't count. Those are, first of all, okay, so here's the thing with that. I really dislike this line of argumentation that we've seen the results of Marxism in the Soviet Union and China. The Soviet Union and China, first of all, didn't deploy philosophy directly from Marx. They deployed philosophy derived from Marx. That's one thing. The second thing is that they didn't actually deploy that philosophy consistently. There were pragmatic there were exigencies that they had to address pragmatically, and they did. What they happened upon wasn't just the product of philosophy, it was the product of trying to deal with, a combination of things. Immense political corruption, for one, trying to deal with an immensely complicated political situation being another. There was a civil war, after all, among other things, a Cold War, massive foreign intervention, things like that. It's not exactly it's not exactly a philosophically pure situation, is it? It's a mess. By that same logic, if I'm not saying that that's what JM is saying, maybe he's clarified, but by that same logic, you would have to say that, well, we've seen the results of Christianity. Why? Well, look at the LRA. Look at Marx. Okay, how about this? Marx took a lot of his ethics from political liberalism, which took a lot of its, all of its ethics, really, from an English interpretation of Christian virtues, of Christian values and Christian ideals and Christian ethics. Is the Soviet Union the fault of Christianity? No. Well, for the same reason, it's not the fault of Marx. And you should take Marx seriously. Marx was a serious political thinker. There's a reason why serious political thinkers, like Carl Schmitt being a big one, like Hannah Arendt, like all these people, why they took him seriously, because he had first of all very insightful things to say, and then in addition to that, he spawned a massive amount of actually very serious critical thought. So yeah, you can't not take Marx seriously. You can disagree with Marx. He was just a man. He made mistakes. I disagree with him. I think he, like Arendt, by the way, it's my critique of Arendt, I think he fetishized concepts that come out of a particular Greek historical context. And this is true of political theory generally, to be fair. With exceptions, of course, especially recently, but generally true of political philosophy. I think he fetishized that as natural, and I think that causes some of the contradictions in his thinking, because, and again, I'm speaking as a layperson on Marx, but if you read the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is one of the best things by him that I have read, he characterizes the failure of the French Revolution as a failure to move away essentially from the mythological constructions of traditional France. It's been a long time, so my take on this is going to be bad, but by doing this, by fetishizing these political categories, playing the same game, he is reifying the same game, it's going to have the same results. And maybe this is borne out in the Soviet Union, because maybe, again, like, it is a misreading of human nature, as the cliche goes, but it's a misreading of human nature that everybody else also makes. So I don't think it's fair to critique Marx on those grounds. And no, I'm not a Pinko Devani. I would have read more Marx if I was. I read very little Marxist work, as a matter of fact. Although I will say this, and actually, I think I mentioned this in the video I'm going to be publishing today. Marxist political theory, for whatever faults you may find in Marxism generally, excellent use of empirical sources, like just an absolute wealth of actual data, which is curious because they're usually criticized for being anti-data. But if you look, like, for example, Indian Migration and Empire, Colonial Genealogy of the Modern State by Radhika Mongia. I highly recommend this book. You can find it on LibGen for free. Although I would buy it, because this is an author that does deserve support, but you can find it there if you want it. One of the most incisive histories of the modern state that I've ever seen. And it's not going to get a lot of uptake strictly because it's being written by a Marxist sociologist, but this is a person who has done tremendously cutting work. So, yeah, I think I'm very strongly of the opinion that the hate for Marxist philosophers is unjust. I think they get a very unfair shake. Yeah. Actually, there's a little battle going on in here. Oh, I see. So Lily Voittooth is clarifying the Vauch's political line thing. So the political line is Vauch's political compass-like thing. He views politics as a spectrum between the poles of egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism. I mean, insofar as they form a binary, I guess you could draw egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism as a spectrum, and maybe there's a pragmatic benefit in doing this. I don't think that's essentially true, but I don't know why he's doing that exactly. If again, this is strictly, Vauch is very much concerned with practical politics. I'm a political theorist, so I'm going to find issues with this. I don't necessarily think that it doesn't make sense on those grounds, but yeah. Aha. Thought you could pull a fast one on me, eh? You probably can. I probably shouldn't say anything. But, yeah. John McDonnell asks, hi, Sunday, you're in academia, right? What level of study gives you this level of detail? I'm looking at degree options right now. It's not the degree, not to toot my own horn, but assuming I have some modest capacities in this area. Honestly, the biggest thing is read really heavily. I would do this. Here's what I would do. The way in which political science, if you're going into political science, and I only know political science to be clear. Like I've been in philosophy departments. I don't really like sociology departments that much, but maybe I haven't given them a fair shake. Like again, I used to be a conservative, so I went in with some presuppositions that were probably antithetical to my education. But if you're going into political science, and I think political science is a very valid place to go, it used to be the case that you would get a holistic education in the history of political theory. So, for example, at my university, you initially got a political philosophy course that ran the entire year long, and you would get your Plato, you would get your Aristotle, you would get your, maybe Augustine, but definitely Aquinas. You'd get your English philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Mill. You get Rousseau, you get Kant. You might get Weber. You might get. You probably should get Weber. You'd get maybe someone like Gandhi. Surprisingly little Marx, but you would probably get Marx as well. And this would be mandatory to graduate, right? So you would not graduate from political science with your BA without having read Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, a little bit of Marx, Weber, Kant, Rousseau. Now it's divided into 3 courses, of which you are only required to take 1. So you will either read Plato and Aristotle, and maybe Augustine and Aquinas, but these are going to be rush jobs, of course, because, look, the Republican politics are long enough as it is, and detailed enough. You could spend months just on them. I spent like a 6-month, a full semester just on Aristotle's Ethics, which was a really good course, and I learned a lot from it. But point is, these things take a lot of time. You can end up just taking Plato and Aristotle, or just Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, or just Marx, John Stuart Mill, maybe Gandhi, what have you, and then graduate with nothing but that. And who's to say if you read them well, you can coast through in these courses. So what I would say is, if you can, take them all. Try to take them all. Like, actually get a firm grounding in the actual philosophical foundations of your discipline, whatever that is. But by the way, if you're in sociology or what have you, it's going to be political philosophy anyways. Definitely do that. Read lots. Definitely don't limit yourself to the texts that they assign in classes. Like, try to keep up. What I generally do, like, as I understand how most classes run, is they'll have like a central text or a central 2 texts around which the course is oriented. And then there will be a plethora of extra material attached to that. that will sort of go into more detail on sort of fine points or debates around certain subtopics or what have you. But generally, courses will be oriented around a single core text. When you're going to college or university, emphasize that text. Read that one thoroughly, annotate it, get that one down. Everything else is tertiary. Now, of course, sometimes there are requirements to read these things for like seminars. You have to have responses, and that's fair. And then you're kind of hooped, just have to do it. But generally, try to do that. Try to make sure you understand the core of it. Understand the core of it. If understanding the core means sacrificing some of these tertiary things, it's a sacrifice worth making. You can come back to that later. You won't learn it unless you understand like the major thing motivating all of this. And again, like the texts are chosen arbitrarily, but that would be how you'd get sort of a really systematic and clear understanding of the actual issue at hand in any given course. In terms of getting a general high level of detail, what my strategy was to try and select my courses based on continuing things that I was sort of developing in previous courses. So I became really interested in ancient Greek politics at one point. Okay, so if I'm really interested in ancient Greek politics, if I want to get a high level of detail in that, what I'm not going to do is take ancient Greek politics and then additionally to that, take an introduction to African politics or politics of surveillance. I mean, I would eventually, but try to make it so that studying deeply in the topics that you were forced to study in deeply doesn't distract you from what you're doing. And that will, at the very least, guarantee that you're always making progress in some direction, because the temptation, especially if you're a working student, and I'm speaking as a working student, so maybe this is different for people with a lot of extra time on their hands, but as a working student, these things pile up really fast, and the temptation will be, and not even a temptation, sometimes it's a necessity. The necessity will be to actually just BS your way through to get the course requirement and finish with a passable grade. I remember, like, actually the course in which I was introduced to Mongia, I didn't even manage to read the book. And I ended up doing my final paper on something boring like mental health amongst migrant workers in China. It was so dull, but it was the only thing I could come up with coherently. Damn Marxist professors. They actually have really high standards when it comes to empirical sources. But I'm really grateful I took that course, because I was introduced to some of the most brilliant political thinkers I've read in the past few years. So, albeit deferred until after the course was over, unfortunately. Let's look at the chess game here quickly. Okay, what am I going to do? All right, so I'm going to do this. Probably a bad idea, but I'm going to do it. Wait, did I mean to go there? What did I mean to do? I can't remember. Okay. Yeah, so. Oh, Katsumi Kyoto, President Sunday, could you put that author in text? Did you mean Radhika Mongia? I'll put that one down. If you meant somebody else, let me know. Radhika Mongia is a Marxist sociologist in a university, I think, in Alberta. Very smart lady, though. The Last Man. I mentioned Carl Schmitt in passing to one of my teachers. I don't think he looked at me the same way again. I hope that wasn't a good sense, because Carl Schmitt is extremely important. He's one of the most incisive and insightful political. I mean, I'm tempted to say, granted, it's probably impudent from my lowly stature as a mere grad student, but I think he's one of the most brilliant political theorists of the last few hundred years, if not the most. So if he's looking at you badly for that, that's to his discredit. I remember one time a friend of mine was busing to, I think it was actually Shruggy. He was busing to the university that we both went to at one time. And he was talking about how I can't remember if it was a professor or a student, but somebody was reading Atlas Shrugged on the bus, and this person flipped out at them. It's just the stupidest thing. It's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with some of these people. All right. God, he's really letting his clock run out. I may just win because he runs out of time. Come on, man. This game is going too slow. John Locke versus Matthew Tyndall, both great deist Christians. That's what Locke said. Or not Locke, Locke's Logos, sorry. Yeah, so if anybody else has any questions, I'm just going to finish off. Does anybody else want to play chess? I'm exhausted, but I can probably put in one more game. But don't feel obligated. Oh, we finally made a move. Okay, good. All right. All right. So what are we going to do? What are you doing? Okay, wait a second. Let's think this through. All right. Lily Voitooth, President Sunday, are you critical of democracy? It depends on what you mean, right? People tend to treat democracy like it's a form of government. Democracy is not a form of government. We don't. It's questionable if. Okay, like the form of government, for example, that we have in the United States and Canada and in Britain is not. The form of government isn't democracy. The form of government is a republic with a series of plebiscites to replace the rulership, right? But plebiscites doesn't equal democracy. Democracy is a regime type, which is different than a form of government. And again, this is a more sort of nuanced classical Greek view of this, but democracy is a situation in which political power is derived from the demos, and the demos is understood in this case to be the generality of the population defined by sort of regional community interests rather than tribal interests. So it's questionable if today democracy is even optional so much as it's necessary insofar as we are all more or less detribalized, right? Like if we are tribal, we're tribal on grounds of political ideology or race or religion or things of an artificial construction. Whereas, yeah, so it's not even really because an artificial construction imposed on a population, inhering in their description as people, as individuals. Sorry, I'm getting so tired right now. It's yeah, I don't think democracy is really escapable. I think democracy kind of defines sort of the way in which, at least within states, power is emergent, right? I am critical of certain kinds of Republican government. I certainly think they're generally treated with not enough skepticism. As what did you do? Why did you do that? Hang on. Why did he do that? Okay, so that doesn't make any sense because now I'm going to do this. Oh shoot! I didn't even see that. Oh my god, I'm so tired. uh, yeah, that's dumb. Delaney asks, are you critical of voting? No, I'm not critical of voting. I am critical of the idea that you have a duty to vote if you don't have a strong opinion on who you're voting for. But that's not exactly the same thing, is it? Yeah, so I'm not against people not voting. I don't think people should be compelled to vote, but I'm not critical of voting as such. That being said, I think the cult of voting is damaging. I think people shouldn't be discouraged from wanting to be informed before they start taking part in the political decision-making process of their communities. So that's my take on that. Akira Kazawa says, you say you're now on the left. I don't say I'm now on the left. I'm just not on the right. Do I reject all brands of hierarchy? Absolutely not. And furthermore, I don't think generally people on the left reject all brands of hierarchy. I mean, certainly there are people at a low level who do, but these people are naive. I think serious people on the left generally don't reject hierarchy at all. What they are critical of are existing hierarchies that they believe to be unjust or to be harmful. And I think there's legitimacy to a lot of these points. So I mean, like, I think when people say hierarchy needs to be overcome, I think they're just being sort of myopic in their phrasing. I think, generally speaking, from what I've seen, and I could be wrong, from what I've seen is that when people on the left say they want to undo hierarchy, what they want to do is undo unnatural hierarchies that are being imposed as natural. They've been naturalized with harmful effects. And I think there's a lot of examples of these you can point to pretty easily. So, like, I don't think the idea, for example, that women shouldn't be allowed to partake in politics, for instance, or to have an education on a par with men historically has anything to commend it whatsoever. And that would, and here's the thing, like, as a result of that happening, there is now a norm, a large number of norms, in fact, that are directly related to the position of women in society based upon the assumption that they fulfilled a particular role that did not imply a certain degree of education or what have you. So I think that's perfectly legitimate to criticize. Now, that being said, I do think some people sort of overstep what they actually know, and they'll start sort of wantonly criticizing things that maybe historically actually inform the basis of their own criticism. So, for example, you'll see a lot of anti-colonial rhetoric being very much concerned with being very anti-Christian in their language. And historically, it's understandable because Christianity was used as a colonial tool in a lot of cases, or Christians were very abusive and condescending and chauvinistic with regards to them. That being said, the concern for the autonomy of cultures, things like that comes from liberalism, that comes from Christianity. So you can't just throw these things out whole cloth. You have to be careful and specific. And of course, like, there is a certain extent to which a lot of left-wing politics has been turned into a racket, as well as right-wing politics as well, in which people basically grift by engaging in sort of low-risk activism, like, especially in places like Victoria where very little is going on. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to just say things without substantiating them, but there are cases where people sort of cynically take on these left-wing talking points in order to set themselves up for positions in nonprofits, positions in media, what have you. But yeah. Kira Kazuha continues, so a cynical one could say that the left rejects any hierarchy that doesn't place themselves as the leader of these institutions. I don't think that's a fair characterization of the left. In fact, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's generally nihilistic either. There are theologians on the left, for example. And what is a traditional frame? Okay, here's something I'm going to bring up in this video. So human rights doctrine is often critiqued by conservatives, right? as something sort of recent and unnatural. It's a secular construction and a substitute for, let's say, human dignity in the religious sense. Does that seem like a fair characterization? Does anybody want to challenge that? Okay, guess where human rights doctrine comes from? The earliest articulation, the theoretical foundations of it, come from the critiques of theologians, especially in Spain, during the 15th century. 15th century? Let me double check that. My Vittoria is a little bit weak. But it comes from... where are you? Where are you? People. There we go. Francisco de Vitoria was a Spanish Roman Catholic philosopher, theologian, and jurist of Renaissance Spain. I'm just reading the Wikipedia article for you. He is the founder of the tradition in philosophy known as the School of Salamanca, noted especially for his contributions to the theory of just war and international law. Francisco de Vitoria was one of the first articulators of what would eventually be called human rights. The idea that by dint of being human, the natives of America that were being manipulated and abused by the Spanish conquistadors had a right to not be. This is older, and yes, it was 15th century, but he died in the 16th century. So he was young in the 15th century, and then in the 16th century, he lived for about 46 years. So what this means, by the way, is that human rights doctrine in its earliest formulations is older than conservatism. So how's that? So yeah, so I don't buy for a second that the left is generally speaking nihilistic. I think left and right are only really a thing that makes sense in a particular historical context, less so now. So, yeah. Akira Kazuya said, I didn't hear what you said. I apologize. I'm not sure what that's referring to. So let me know what you missed, and I'll try to clarify that. Okay. Oh, you fool. You absolute fool. What the fork? This is called a fork, by the way. When you manage to attack two pieces simultaneously in chess, that's called a fork. I made a fork joke. Ilvani, you timed out Katsumi? These little leftist tyrants I put in charge of my channel. Unbelievable. Sorry. No, he was just trying to somebody else. All right, I'm going to finish this chess game. He might resign at this point. He should resign at this point. He was winning. He was doing so well. And now all is lost. Okay, okay, let me see. Maybe I can... It doesn't say Katsumi's in timeout. Is Katsumi back? Like when I go onto here, it says I can put user in timeout. So I think that should imply that Katsumi isn't in timeout, right? Am I wrong? Boom, boom. Oh no, he's gonna move the pawn, isn't he? He's gonna do it. He's gonna move the pawn. He's gonna lose his bishop. Oh no, you poor fool. Does anybody else have any questions at all? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up when this chess game ends, which should be in any second now. I think he's going to resign. But if he moves this, I'll put him in a fork again right here. And then I kind of hope he does that. Come on, move your pawn. Do it, coward. Yeah. Who is the most overrated political theorist? Depends on what you mean. Do you mean like of the main line of political theorists? Like of sort of the canon? In terms of the actual quality of their theory, I want to say Locke. Locke is massively influential. He had a lot of really good stuff to say, but Locke or Mill. No, I'm not going to say Locke. I think Locke's actually pretty interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. Let me think about that. Most overrated political theorists. Most political theorists aren't really rated that highly. I'm trying to think of people who I'm critical of who I think aren't that great, who are actually highly rated. But generally, these people are selected for pretty well. I think Moldbug is generally trash, but that's just me. Locke's logo says, President Sunday, what is your view on Canada being... Sorry, what is your view on Canada being the left's biggest utopia? Canada is barely even a state by itself. Canadian politics is defined by Canada being a border country. I mean, basically, like, Canadian politics is almost entirely defined by its immigration politics. And its immigration politics are almost entirely defined by norms derived from liberal Britain and increasingly the United States. So it's not a leftist utopia at all. Canada is actually incredibly right-wing. It's extremely right-wing. The West Coast, I mean, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of left-wing activists, but Canada itself, oops, I got a minute left. What do I do? There we go. But yeah, no, Canada is not a left-wing utopia at all. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry, Kat. Oh, Katsumi's back. Yay. Okay. Back from their adventure. Yeah. Yes, next time we just wait. This is terrible. Has anybody else seen the Distributus latest video? Maybe you can give me your thoughts on it. Maybe they'll amend mine before I actually publish my critique. Okay, we have to outlast him at this point. Damn it. Wait, okay. Can we use this? Oh, I'm not sure that we can. Okay, let's go here. Shoot, we are running out of time. I got cocky with that one. Some of the last man says some of the populists might be right wing, but most government officials look like intersectional crazies from the outside. Yeah, but I feel like with a lot of these people, a lot of things look like intersectional crazies to them. So, Canadian politics is not that radical at all. The United States is actually ahead of Canada in a lot of respects. Locke's Logos, non-serious question. You play any instrument? I had a brief stint trying to learn the mandolin, which I still have, and I have not learned. So, if that counts. Lily Voidtooth, any thoughts on primitivism? I don't. No thoughts at all. Yeah. Katsuma Kyoto, I had serious issues with how the Distributus defined anti-whites and was critical of the racial concepts of whiteness. I'd agree with that. I also didn't like how he tried to use culture as an alibi. He tried to, for example, so one of the things I'll bring up is he tried to say that problems in facing black communities in the U.S. may be things that only the black community can solve. There may be cultural problems, is his language, within the black communities that only black communities can solve. Here's the problem, right? So this is invoking culture, but by saying that, by depicting culture as if it has an inside and an outside, you are and attributing blackness to that culture, you are directly what you are doing is you're saying culture, but you're meaning something whose contours are traceable directly synchronous with race. So, sorry, I'm a bit distracted right now. I need to make this guy spin. Don't you dare, you bastard! Fuck. Pardon my language. Yes. Come on. Damn it. Die. Ah. Oh, haha, yes. We win. All right. Okay. We won, and that's what matters. To hell with fun. All right, so anybody has any more questions, I'm going to wrap up here because it's going on 2 hours and I'm dead tired. And I have another video to edit, so yeah. Just kill me. Katsuma Kyoto says race and culture for him seems to be the same. Not exactly. That's the trick, right? If it was just the fact that race and culture were the same and he was upfront about this, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I mean, I'd have a problem with it on theoretical grounds. It's wrong. I think it has pernicious outcomes, that belief. But if he was upfront about it, I wouldn't be commenting on it. It's just a dumb argument. What he's trying to do, though, is he's trying to pass off a racial argument as a cultural one. And that's right. That's where I take issue. It's literally using culture as an alibi for racism, which is not okay. And again, like, I'm not responding to Keith Woods on these same topics. Why? Because he's honest. I don't like how he gets to his positions. I don't agree with his positions, but he's not trying to conceal what his positions are. That's the key distinction here, and why I'm going to be responding to it. So, yeah. Yeah, so that's that. But you'll see that later. So. All right, well, I'm gonna call it now. So, thanks for participating. Thanks for the questions. I think the discussion with McManus was interesting. It was a little bit scattered because I was just underprepared, so that's my fault. But yeah, we'll probably do it again in the future. Probably, hopefully, on something a bit more structured. So, anyways, thanks very much, guys. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.